Why is it that we'd rather suffer with someone than be alone with ourselves? Why do we cling to relationships that drain us, confuse us, or belittle us just to avoid the silence of solitude? There's something deeply paradoxical in the way we treat loneliness. We fear it like a disease, yet it's often the very cure we need. And the truth, the uncomfortable, liberating truth, is this: being alone, truly alone, can be more fulfilling, more peaceful, and more real than any relationship built on need, fear, or illusion. You see, we've been conditioned to believe that connection is always better than solitude. But not all connections nourish. Some suffocate. Some disconnect us from ourselves. Some are so full of noise that we forget what our own voice sounds like. And the tragedy is, we stay. We stay because we think being alone is a failure. We stay because we've mistaken familiarity for love. We stay because we're terrified of what we'll find in the mirror when no one else is around to distract us. But here's the secret that philosophers have whispered for centuries: solitude is not emptiness. It's space. It's clarity. It's the sacred silence where your soul finally gets to speak. And when you listen, really listen, you start to realize how many of your relationships were rooted in fear, not love. In dependency, not depth. In performance, not presence. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." But we rarely go there, because it's easier to stay distracted, easier to be needed than to be known, easier to be in a relationship than to confront whether it's the right one. But let's ask something radical. What if solitude isn't a punishment, but a portal? A path to wholeness?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
What if being alone was never the problem, but a mirror showing us the real one? Toxic relationships don't just harm us through conflict. They harm us through erosion. They erode our self-trust. They erode our clarity. They erode that quiet sense of self that says, "I know who I am." And once that erosion begins, we start outsourcing everything. We ask others to validate us, to define us, to remind us that we matter. But here's the wild part. The more we rely on others to tell us who we are, the more we forget. We become echoes, reflections, replicas of who we think we should be to keep the peace, to keep the love, to keep the connection. And that's not love. That's survival. That's spiritual codependency masquerading as intimacy. So what would happen if you stopped? If you walked away from the noise, the drama, the confusion, and chose solitude instead? Not as a retreat, but as a revolution. Not as isolation, but as integration. Because the irony is, you only fear being alone when you don't know who you are alone. Once you do, solitude becomes sanctuary. It becomes the most honest place you've ever been. And in that honesty, you find something rare in this world, peace that wasn't purchased by performance. But let's get real. Choosing solitude, especially after years of toxic entanglements, is terrifying. It feels like death. And in a way it is. A death of the role you played. A death of the version of you that tolerated too much. A death of the illusion that someone else will complete you. And that death is necessary. Because only in that space can something new be born: you. The real you. The unedited you. The you that doesn't shrink to fit someone else's comfort zone. The you that doesn't beg to be seen. The you that remembers, I am already whole. But wholeness requires space. It requires time. It requires solitude, not forever. not in isolation from the world, but as a season of soul retrieval, or return, or reckoning. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Because when you're alone, things get quiet. And when things get quiet, the truth gets loud. All the things you ignored in toxic relationships, the red flags, the self-abandonment, the compromises that broke your spirit, they come rushing back. Not to shame you, but to free you, to show you what you've been carrying that was never yours. And once you see it, you can finally set it down. That's the gift of solitude. It's not just about absence. It's about presence. Presence with yourself. Presence with your pain. Presence with the parts of you that got lost trying to be loved. And in that presence, you start to realize something profound. You were never hard to love, you were just surrounded by people who didn't know how. And that realization, that's when the healing begins. Because when you stop trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your energy. You stop leaking your soul into relationships that only knew how to take. And you start pouring that energy into yourself, into your art, into your breath, into your becoming. But here's the deeper layer. It's not just about leaving toxic people. It's about confronting the part of you that attracted them. The part of you that thought chaos was normal. The part of you that mistook intensity for intimacy. The part of you that believed love had to be earned by enduring pain. That's the root. And you can't reach it when you're still entangled. You can't see yourself clearly through someone else's distortion. You need solitude. You need stillness. You need space. Not to escape life, but to finally enter it. Fully, freely, fiercely. And when you do, everything changes. Your standards rise. Your clarity sharpens. Your energy becomes sovereign not because you've built walls, but because you've built self-respect. And from that place, you no longer attract toxicity not because you're guarded, but because you're whole. Toxic relationships require a vacancy, a crack in your sense of self, a gap in your boundaries. When those seal up, there's nothing left for toxicity to feed on. You become untouchable not in a distant way, but in a rooted way. You're no longer seeking someone to save you because you've already come home to yourself. And that home, that's the ultimate relationship. The one between you and your own soul. The one that doesn't collapse when someone else leaves. The one that doesn't disappear when you're not being validated. The one that says, I know who I am, even when no one is clapping. And that's when relationships get interesting. Because now you're not looking for someone to complete you. You're looking for someone to complement you. To co-create, not codepend. To meet you in wholeness, not rescue you from loneliness. And that kind of love, it only finds you when you've made peace with being alone. It only finds you when you've stopped begging and started becoming. So let me ask you something deep, dangerously deep. What relationship are you holding on to that is costing you your peace? And now ask, what would it feel like to choose yourself over that connection? Not because you don't care, but because you finally do. You care enough about your soul to stop handing it to people who can't hold it. You care enough about your peace to walk away from anything that disturbs it. You care enough about your life to stop spending it on relationships that only drain you. That's not selfish. That's sacred. And it begins with solitude, with the courage to sit alone and say, I am enough. Not someday, not when someone chooses me, not when I'm in a relationship. Now. alone, whole, real. And that's the kind of happiness no toxic relationship can compete with. But we're not done. Because if you want to live this truth, not just hear it, you need a new blueprint. You need a way to rebuild your inner world so that it no longer needs toxic connections to feel alive. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. The moment you walk away from a toxic relationship is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the most important chapter rebuilding the inner world that was shaped, distorted, or even shattered by being entangled with someone who didn't know how to love you, or worse, someone who weaponized your love against you. Because the truth is, we don't just leave people, we leave patterns. We leave the echoes of our own unmet needs. We leave the illusions we clung to. We leave the version of ourselves that tolerated less because we believed we were less. And this is where the real work begins. When the silence settles and the noise is gone, you're left with yourself. All of yourself. The parts that were hidden. The parts that were silenced. The parts that were shaped around someone else's chaos. And here's the paradox of healing. It doesn't start with fixing, it starts with feeling. You have to sit in the rawness of it all. The grief, the confusion, the guilt, the anger. Not to dwell, but to understand. Because every emotion is a doorway. Every ache is a message. And if you're brave enough to listen, you'll uncover the roots of why you stayed, why you tolerated, why you bent yourself into someone unrecognizable. And when you see it clearly, without shame, without judgment, only then can you begin to rewire. Because rewiring isn't about pretending you were never hurt. It's about deciding what that hurt will mean. Will it be the reason you close your heart forever? Or the reason you open it more wisely? Will it be the proof that you're broken? Or the evidence that you're healing? That choice is yours. And it begins with the first powerful truth. Your worth is not determined by who chooses to love you. That sentence alone, if felt deeply, can undo years of conditioning. You are not valuable because someone else says so. You are not lovable because you are needed. You are not enough because someone stayed. You are enough because you are. Right now, without proof, without permission, without performance. And the more you root into that truth, the less you chase validation. You stop checking your phone hoping they reached out. You stop replaying the last conversation trying to decode their silence. You stop measuring your value by the absence or presence of someone who was never meant to stay. Instead, you start turning inward. You start asking better questions, not why didn't they love me, but why did I abandon myself to be loved by them? Not what did I do wrong, but what part of me believed I had to earn love by suffering. These questions hurt, but they heal. They shine light into the spaces where the wound first began. Maybe it was childhood. Maybe it was a belief you inherited. Maybe it was a moment when someone taught you explicitly or subtly that love means sacrifice, silence, or survival. But you're not that child anymore. You're not that powerless. You're not that small. You're awake now. And in that awakening, you realize healing isn't about going back to who you were before the relationship. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be. Someone who doesn't confuse chaos with chemistry. Someone who doesn't negotiate their needs just to keep someone close. Someone who doesn't fear being alone because their own company is finally enough. And that kind of healing, it's sacred. It requires solitude. It requires space. It requires unlearning everything you thought love was and replacing it with what it actually is: freedom, respect, reciprocity, and peace. And peace isn't passive. It's powerful. Because when you've made peace with yourself, you stop letting people disturb it so easily. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop falling for potential instead of presence. You start choosing people who meet you not just emotionally but energetically. And you no longer chase. You no longer beg. You no longer tolerate breadcrumbs when you know you were made for banquets. But none of that happens if you don't do the work alone. If you rush into the next distraction. If you numb the pain with busyness or bodies or borrowed identities. You have to sit in it. You have to let the silence speak. You have to let the loneliness wash through you until it becomes solitude, and then until it becomes strength. That's the rewiring, not a quick fix. Not a rebound, a radical return to self. And as you rebuild, you start to notice something profound. The things you used to crave attention, validation, drama, they start to feel heavy, loud, unnecessary. You no longer need someone to fill your silence. You protect it. You no longer need someone to mirror your worth. You embody it. You no longer need the old patterns to feel alive. You feel alive because you're finally aligned. And in that alignment, something magic happens. You start attracting differently. Not just people, but experiences. You start radiating something that can't be faked: wholeness. You walk into rooms without shrinking. You set boundaries without guilt. You speak your truth without apology. And the people who resonate with that version of you, your healed self, your real self, they stay. Not because you need them to, but because they want to dance in the same frequency. That's the shift. From attracting what matches your wounds to attracting what matches your wisdom. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a practice, a path. And some days will feel like you've regressed. Some days you'll miss them. Some nights you'll question your strength. That's okay. Healing isn't linear. It's cyclical. Spiral. Layered. But every time you choose yourself, you're creating new neural pathways. Every time you say no to what hurts, you say yes to what heals. Every time you sit alone and feel the ache and still choose peace, you're rewiring your nervous system to believe, I am safe without chaos. I am safe without performance. I am safe without self-abandonment. And that belief will change your life. Because once you believe that peace is possible without needing someone else to provide it, you stop settling. You stop shrinking. You stop giving your power away. And you start living not from fear, but from fullness. Not from lack, but from love. Love for yourself. Love for your becoming. Love for the version of you that walked through fire and came out softer, wiser, clearer. And that version of you, that's the gift of solitude. That's the reward for walking away. That's the proof that being alone isn't a failure, it's a foundation. One that can't be shaken by someone else's departure. One that doesn't collapse when you're not chosen. One that reminds you, I choose me. And that choice ripples into everything. Your friendships, your work, your art, your presence. You stop performing. You start being. And that being is magnetic not because it's loud, but because it's true. So let me ask you one final question. If you stopped waiting for someone to love you the way you deserve, how would you start loving yourself right now? What would you do today, this hour, to show your soul that it matters, that it's seen, that it's no longer willing to be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's inability to meet you. That's the practice. That's the path. And it's available to you always, right now. In this breath, in this moment, in this choice to be alone not as a punishment, but as a portal, not as a retreat, but as a return, not as a break from love, but as the beginning of the only love that ever truly mattered, the one between you and you. Everything else is a reflection. Everything else is a bonus. But your peace, your freedom, your wholeness, that's yours. And it begins the moment you realize being alone has never meant being less. It's always meant being enough.